Hello everyone, welcome to the Sam and Beth Variety Show. Today we're going to introduce a new series here. I realize that a lot of the videos we have on our channel so far are music arrangements and compositions, and it's come to my attention that maybe some of our viewers don't actually read music. So I thought I would take some time to make a small series of videos here to teach you the basics of reading and writing music. Because, really that's a skill everyone should have. It's a good time. For this series, I'm going to assume that anyone watching has not had any experience in music, doesn't know anything about reading music or writing music, so that's where we're going to start at the very beginning. If you do have experience reading and writing music, stay tuned, because we might get to a point where you might have some more advanced stuff that you're not so familiar with, and I want you guys to be involved as well. So today for our first lesson, I want to do an introduction to the grand staff, the treble clef, the bass clef, and ledger lines. Now this here, for those of you who know nothing about music, this is the grand staff. You've got here a little funny symbol here, a little funny symbol down here, and then you've got this little bracket, and then these series of 5 lines over each of these. This is the grand staff. Anytime you see this, think of it as like an artist's canvas. Anything is possible here. This is a blank slate. However, unlike art where you can just kind of do anything you want, music, you have to follow some rules. It's actually probably a bit more like writing a book. If you're writing a book, you have to follow certain sentence structures and you have to have correct spellings, because if you don't follow those rules, the person reading it isn't going to understand the message you're trying to portray. Well, it's kind of like music as well. If you go outside the rules of music, whoever is reading the music won't understand what the music is supposed to sound like, or how they're supposed to sing it, or how they're supposed to play it. So it's very important that we follow the rules of music in order for it to be interpreted correctly. And one of the things I want to point out about the grand staff before we move on is these series of lines and spaces on each of these symbols here, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Now, if you're singing really high notes, they're going to be up here in this area. And if you're singing really low notes, they're going to be down here. So that is what we call a pitch. Pitch is how high or how low your sound is. And we'll get to how we interpret those right away here. So all pitches in music are represented by the first 7 letters of the alphabet. So if you've gone to elementary school, this is easy for you. It's A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. And after G, it repeats to A. It goes A, B, C, D, E, F, G. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. It always repeats. You only need the first 7 letters of the alphabet in order to read music. Now, the grand staff, as you saw before, had 2 little funny symbols on it. And these symbols are called the treble clef and the bass clef. And this is what makes up the grand staff. So let's go into each of these. Alright, so let's talk about the treble clef. The treble clef, as I said before, has higher pitches. So if you're singing, if you're a lady singing, usually you're singing alto or soprano, you have really high notes that you have to sing. And if you're playing an instrument like a flute, a clarinet, trumpet, or violin, those will all be written in the treble clef. The treble clef is also called the G clef, as the spiral of the clef symbol surrounds the note G on the second line from the bottom. Here's the little spiral part of it. Here's the second line from the bottom. Here's the note G. G is on the second line from the bottom. All notes on the grand staff or any staff are represented in these lines and spaces. Here at the second line from the bottom we have G. We'll have notes on each of these lines and also every space in between. Here we're going back to our note G right here on the second line from the bottom in the treble clef. It just repeats the pattern. Remember, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So we have G here. Move up to the space above it, that's A. The line above that is B, space above that is C, the line above that D, then E, then F, and so on. Now, if we go back here, G, if we're going down, we have to go backwards in the alphabet. So from G, space below it is F, and the line below that is E. Here I have a diagram that splits up the spaces and the lines for you. So the first space, we have F, second space is A, third space is C, and then the fourth and final space is E. For the lines of the treble clef, first line is E, then second line from the bottom is G. You should know that. It's the G clef, second line from the bottom. Third line, B, fourth line, D, and the final line is F. Now, it's hard to remember that just by looking at it and trying to contribute that to memory, so there are some mnemonic devices we use in music to help us memorize these. So one thing that we can do for the spaces, remember, is F-A-C-E. These spell out the word face, which rhymes with space, so that's pretty easy to remember. That's what most people use for the spaces of the treble clef. It's just face, F-A-C-E. Now for the lines, you can use like a little fun sentence like for E, G, B, D, F, every good boy does fine. If you can remember that sentence, you'll remember E, G, B, D, F, which is a little bit easier than just remembering the word igbadif. Doesn't quite work as well. So every good boy does fine and face. That'll help you memorize all the lines and spaces of the treble clef. Now let's move on to the bass clef. This is where the lower pitches of music are. So if you're singing men's parts like tenor or bass, you're going to have lower notes, lower pitches. Or if you're playing an instrument like the cello, the tuba, the trombone, or the euphonium, those will all be written typically in bass clef. The bass clef is also called the F clef, as the dots on the clef symbol straddle the note F on the fourth line. If you see down here, here are the two dots of the clef symbol for bass clef. Here's the fourth line. This note is F. Now, in treble clef, this would be the note D, if you remember. However, in bass clef, the fourth line is F. So remember that. This is the F clef. Now, however, it does follow the same pattern of A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So here's our fourth line. This is F in the F clef or in the bass clef. Going forward, F, space up is G, line above that is A. Now going down in pitch, we go backwards from F, space below E, line below that D, then C, B, A, G. Now here's another diagram of the bass clef with the spaces and lines separated. If we go here from the first space in the bass clef, it's A, then the second space is C, third space is E, fourth space is G. For the lines, first line G, second line B, then D, F, and A. Now again, we have mnemonic devices we can use for the bass clef. For the spaces, unfortunately, we don't have a fun word that spells out here. Kind of ace, it doesn't really work as a word like face does for the treble clef, but we can use a sentence. If A, C, E, G, we can have a phrase like, all cars eat gas. For the lines, again, we have another fun phrase we can use to help memorize it. Good burritos don't fall apart. GBDFA. Good burritos don't fall apart. You can try to memorize those sentences, and that'll help you memorize the spaces and the lines in the bass clef. Remember, they're not exactly the same as the treble clef. So looking back at what we've learned so far about the grand staff and the bass clef and the treble clef, it looks like we're missing some notes. Remember, we had the grand staff, the treble clef on top of the bass clef connected together. But if we look at the top line of the bass clef, good burritos don't fall apart, the A here skips to the bottom line of the treble clef E for every good boy does fine. So if we're continuing the pattern of A, B, C, D, E, F, G, where are B, C, and D? We're missing those. Or are we? This is where ledger lines come in. So ledger lines are small lines added to represent pitches above and below the staff, continuing the pattern. So if we take a look at the treble clef here, remember every good boy does fine. Here's the fifth line, F. We go above that line, we have G, continuing our pattern of A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And then repeating that, we see this little small line added above that. That's now A. This is on a line. It's A. It's a ledger line. We go above that ledger line, we have B, which is kind of like a space. It's above the ledger line. Then we add another ledger line for C, then another one for D, and E, F, etc. Now if we're going down, again, you go backwards in the alphabet. So here we would have at the bottom line would be E. It's not shown here on this diagram, but we know that would be E for every good boy does fine. We go below that line, it's D. Then we have a ledger line added for C, then B, A, G, F, E, so on. Going down now here to the bass clef. Remember, good burritos don't fall apart. Here's our top line A. Go above that, it's B. Then we add a ledger line for C to D, E, F, G, A. Now going down backwards again. Remember this bottom line would be G. Good burritos don't fall apart. This bottom first line. From there would be F going below that line. Then we add a ledger line for E. below that D, then another line for C, B, A, G, etc. Before moving on to the grand staff, again, I want to point out middle C in the treble and the bass clef. Middle C is a very important note, and you'll see in just a second why. Middle C in the treble clef is actually this last note right here. It's the first ledger line below the staff. Remember, this bottom line here is E. The first line is E. Every good boy does fine. E, D, C. See, this is middle C right here. This note right here. Remember that. That's middle C. Now in the bass clef, it's going up. So remember, good burritos don't fall apart. Here's A, B, and then this ledger line right here, this is C. This is actually middle C as well. It's the same note. If that confuses you, just wait just a second. I'll show you what I mean. This here is a diagram of middle C on the grand staff. See how it's right in the middle between both the clef marks. It's middle C. Now the name makes sense to you if you didn't understand before. So remember, on our bass clef, good burritos don't fall apart. Here's our line A. A, this would be B below it right here, and then C. This is middle C. Or on the treble clef, every good boy does fine. E is the first line. Below that is D, and then we have C right here. It's the same note. That's middle C on the grand staff. Here's another diagram for you if it helps. This is pretty much the bass clef filled in and the treble clef filled in, and it points out here that this is middle C. This is the same note on both clefs. Theoretically, you can have an infinite amount of ledger lines going above and below the staff. It's not very common to have more than 3 ledger lines used for a note, but it is possible. It does show up every once in a while, but again, it's not very common. So this is the end of our lesson, our introduction to the grand staff, the treble clef, the bass clef, and ledger lines. If you didn't get all of it the first time, that's totally fine. You can go back and watch it again, help you memorize the names and the lines and spaces and the patterns. Don't feel bad if you don't get it all in one go. It's not like you can read English in one day. Anyone who learns any language knows that you can't just pick it up in one day. Don't feel bad that if you're not getting this right away. It takes practice. It takes years of practice to get this stuff down. So that's the end of our lesson for today. Again, you can go back and watch. If you have questions or things that I didn't address, you can put them down in the comments. Although I suspect that if you have questions or comments, a lot of it will be answered in future videos. I hope to do at least 1 or 2 videos a week if I'm doing well. I'm not going to guarantee that, but that's what I'm going to aim for. So next time we come back to the second lesson, I'm going to address the pitches with whole steps and half steps and flats and sharps. So look forward to that. Thanks for watching.